Hello, Shark fans, and we are here for day 2 of Shark Week. So let's jump right into the water. 3 new episodes. We had Great White Sex Battle. We had Jaws versus Mega Croc, and then we had In the Eye of the Storm, Shark Storm. All right, 3 new shows. This is day 2. This is Monday of Shark Week. All right, so in my honest review, I feel as though day 2 was less interesting than day 1. Day 1 to me was a decent start, to be honest. It felt I was engaged, especially starting off with the entertainment factor and then leading into the science, right? Day 2 was much more science heavy, right? But even as a scientist, I can't say that I was fully engaged because it felt kind of like the run-of-the-mill random shark experiments just for Shark Week purposes. It didn't feel like it had a lot of scientific value, if I'm being honest. Of course, there were certain things that you could take from the data that they collected, but it wasn't like it didn't feel necessary. It didn't feel like it helped. It didn't feel like it advanced shark science at all. This just felt like, let's play scientists for Shark Week. And granted, these were actual real shark biologists that were out there doing the work. So I'm not trying to take anything away from them, but it's just that the experiments didn't really feel like they had a point, I'm going to say. All right, so the first one, a Great White Sex Battle, right? So Great White Sex Battle basically put great whites in a versus between male versus female. Right? To start off with that felt pointless in itself. Because if you know anything about sharks, you know that the females got it. Like it's not even close. Like female great whites grow larger. So if you're trying to compare them in overall dominance, it doesn't make sense because we know that females are more dominant. They grow larger. They need to in order to be able to, bear the weight of childbirth and take care of themselves. So it felt almost doomed from the start in a sense, right? Now we did have Riley and Corey and some other people there that were working on it, and of course it kind of felt like it jumped in with the natural environment of things and how we in our society are kind of doing it, men versus women kind of thing, in a playful way. But it was just like, what is this? What is this? It felt like last year's episode when they were trying to find the most dominant male and to see, like, how they kind of had like those weird experiments, like measuring clasper size and stuff. Like it felt like that. Because the experiments themselves were like one experiment was breaching. Which sex can gather the most airtime? Another experiment was tug of war, right? So they attached like a bite force meter onto like a bag. It looked like a burlap sack, but it was likely a different material. But it just basically measured the pulling power, right? Actually, that might have been 2 separate experiments. I think there was one where they might measured bite force, and then there was one where they measured pulling power. Actually, no. Take that back. The bite force one was more for the second show, but they did have a tug of war where they had to pull down. It was like a scale basically that measured pounds of pressure that the sharks were able to pull down on a rope, right? Yeah, I mean that in itself was kind of cool, but it was like they were trying to compare which one would matter more in being able to apply the pulling force, the sheer size of the females versus the thrashing motion of males, because males tend to be more aggressive And I don't even necessarily agree with that point. Um, Males do need to show a certain level of aggression in order to be able to mate, in order to be able to survive, being that they're slightly smaller, things of that nature. But they don't necessarily show more aggression. This it felt kind of like human projection almost, right? Um, they do, like I said, they do have to show a certain level of aggression. Um, but I don't necessarily want to call them outright cautious. I mean, no, excuse me, outright reckless, right? Because the females do tend to be exhibit some caution, but again, that's because they have to watch themselves for childbirth, right? Especially if you're dealing with a pregnant female, right? But overall, that larger size is going to lead to like them dominating pretty much everything. Like it felt, I don't know, it felt really pointless. All right, so they had 4 experiments, right? So it was supposed to be 3. The male white sharks took the first one, right? So the first experiment was boldness, right? So the really cool thing that I actually did like this first experiment, kind of, they made a 14-foot model great white that was already in the position to show aggression, right? So it had the gaping mouth and the downward facing pectoral fins, right? Which is basically shark language that we uncovered to basically show other sharks, like, or honestly speaking, maybe even people, I'm not to be messed with right now, right? I'm in an aggressive stance, right? So they built a 14-foot model, placed it outside of a cage, and then put a lure, like a piece of bait, near it, right on top of it, right, and tested to see whether or not, um, whether male or female sharks would be brave enough to go above that aggressive showing shark in order to grab the bait. And by doing so, they would be exposing their vulnerable side, right? So going back to my model, that is exposing here, right? Um, the blind spot from the previous day, right? Um, because of course that's where all the vital organs are. That's where they're the most vulnerable, right? And if the shark was able to go and try and retrieve the bait, even though that shark was there, it gave that team a point. Now the dope thing about this experiment was that it didn't just show like that the sharks were mindless beasts. They weren't just going and like food, give me food. No, they were testing and probing this 14-foot model. They were like, hold up, something ain't right here. They kept going. They ignored the bait and went straight for the model and kept touching it, knocking it, and eventually biting it like, yeah, this thing ain't real. This is no threat. And once one of them did that, the rest of them knew it too. So it was like it showed that they had the capacity for learned behavior in an environment. That was, to me, that was like the best part of it. Not gonna, I love that part. So the first ones to do this, the ones that tested the model out, were the males. They went up, they bumped it, boom, 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 and they were good. But they started early, so the males kept going in, grabbing the bait. They started early. They ended up winning this round because they got the most points because they took the most bait. But once the males started, then the females knew, okay, this is no threat. So then the females came in, right? So that was the first round. Second round was, I believe that one was, that might have been the pulling power, right? Pulling power, no contest. Women won that. Females won that. It was like, wasn't even close. It was like, that was, to me, that was a pointless experiment, right? Yeah. So women won that one, right? Um, the third experiment was breaching, right? Airtime. Who would breach and then basically stay with their snout, the tip of their snout, above the water line for the longest. That experiment actually ended in a tie, right? I forget the exact time. I believe it was something around like 1.46 seconds, something like that. But it resulted in a tie, right? So now we're all tied, right? We have 1 point for the males, 1 point for the females, and then tied for the third one. They did a fourth experiment as a tiebreaker, and for this experiment, what they did was they just basically created a gigantic chumsicle and measured the amount of chum that individual sharks would rip off, and whichever sex ripped off the most won. Now, it started off with the males and all that, but something that I actually left out from the second experiment, right? Because they actually did this in both. Once they started going, the more dominant females literally stopped letting the males participate. Yes, going back to the pulling on the sack to measure pulling power, tug of war, the females boxed the males out. I think in that experiment, only one male was able to do it. It was all females after that. And the same thing with this. Like there were some instances where the male will come in real quick and grab a little chunk, or grabs one grab like a 30-pound chunk, was a big one, right? Or like a 50-pound chunk, something like that. Cool. But then you had these huge females. It was the last female grabbed over 100 pounds of chum. This was not close. So for me, that episode was like, this is dumb. It didn't feel like good science. It just felt like Shark Week fun. All right. Moving on to 2. Right. So the second episode was Jaws versus Mega Croc. This one pretty much starred Tristan Guttridge and Rosie Moore. Right. They also had Keena and Sora in there, but it was primarily Tristan and Rosie. Now I do want to give a quick shout out because I recently went to SharkCon this year and I actually met Rosie. And I'm looking at her and I'm like, she looks familiar. Now, granted, they're also playing an episode or playing the show that she's on Netflix on a screen at SharkCon. But at the same time, I'm like, nah, I've seen her on Shark Week before. I'm like, you're a scientist, aren't you? She's like, yeah. And she was kind of like calm and chill. But it was like, it is kind of dope to see these people in real life. I mean, so shout out to her. Jaws versus Mega Croc. So in this episode, what they did was they, similar to the series that they've been doing thus far, which is like Jaws. They did Jaws versus I think the Kraken or something. They did Jaws versus Leviathan. They did Jaws versus Megalodon. And then now they did Jaws versus the Mega Croc. So they did great whites versus saltwater crocodiles, right? Now, when you line them up, yes, there are some things that go point to croc, and there are some things that go point to shark, right? But overall, who's really truly believing that a crocodile is going to take out a fully grown great white? Oh, because they're both 20 feet? The great white has it by like 4,000 pounds. This is not a contest, right? 3,000 pounds, right? Okay, 3 to 4,000, depending, right? But if you have the largest crocs, which are roughly 2,000, the largest great whites, which can be in excess of 5,000, this is not a comparison where, what? Now, the reason why they did this was, I feel, was to highlight the fact that due to changes in the environment, whether it be climate change, whether it be tectonic movements, the future is showing that these predators, these apex predators, will interact, can interact, and have likely interacted in the past, right? Based off of some evidence, right? Especially in areas like Florida. So highlighting that these two predators can interact and what may happen as a result, that was the cool part, right? Tristan was Team Shark, Rosie was Team Croc. One thing that I didn't know that Rosie was an expert in. Well, they at one point they labeled her as an expert with reptiles. But I believe that her specialty was more what they said in the beginning, apex predators, like in general. Like she's more broadly interested in apex predators, not just sharks, not just crocs. So that's kind of dope. I didn't know that about her. So that was interesting to learn just about, her. But they did their series of experiments similar to the previous episode, although in this one they did a bite force meter, right? And at the end, they did a 3D simulation, based off the data that they collected on who would win this fight. Guess who won? The shark. Duh! Like who was picking the croc? Who? This is like Godzilla versus Kong. Like, who thinks Kong's gonna win? What's a king to a god? What is this? Like, that's what it felt like. But all in all, it was a little entertaining, but it felt like there was so much, like if this was a movie, there was so much exposition that I fell asleep in the middle. It didn't have, it was down for too long that it didn't keep people engaged until the end. So again, like I was watching this with my kids, and I was watching this with my wife. She said it out loud. I'm bored. This is boring. So for the casual fan, or no, not even the casual fan, someone who's trying to get interested in it, or someone who like comes to a Shark Week party and is like, "Oh, cool, let me check this out. What's this about?" That show wasn't it. I'm not gonna lie. It was kind of boring. Um, Now going to the last one. In the Eye of the Storm, Shark Storm. Best show of the second day. Hands down in my opinion. Shark Storm made us all cry. I'm not gonna lie. It basically covered several shark attacks that happened on the East Coast, Florida, basically, within a short stint of time, right? There was at one point like 3 shark attacks the same day within 90 minutes of each other, which is insane. They couldn't tell if it was the same individual or multiple sharks. My instincts tells me that it was likely the same shark, because the attacks weren't even far apart. I believe they were all within like a mile or 2 miles of each other. When the attacks happened in 2024, yeah, there was 2024 for those 3 attacks, and there was another set of attacks that happened in like 2022. But it spoke to how those shark attacks changed the feel of the area during that time, because this was actually, it wasn't like the East Coast along the Atlantic Ocean, it was the Gulf, right? The Gulf side. And people out there were not used to shark attacks. There wasn't any shark attacks there for decades at that point, right? So of course that leads to a certain level of comfort. But there was a news reporter there who reported on one of the stories, and he was just like, I never thought I would report on a shark attack. Like, this was new. And then for that many to happen, it like changed the whole outlook of the town, right? And I think some of those attacks actually happened on the 4th of July. Like, it felt just like Jaws. That's exactly what it felt like. And even with those attacks, one of the things that bothered me watching it was like the response took so long. Like, shuts the beaches down. But I guess it is difficult to get to close down such a large stretch of land in a short period of time. But that's basically what it was. It followed along stories of all of the shark attack victims during that time period, what they went through. Like, it detailed their attack first, but it left you on like the edge, right? Because it didn't show them until the end of their story, right? So you didn't know if they survived or not. So it's like, whoa, what's going on, right? And some of the injuries were kind of bad, right? Like, so most of them were just like, bit in the leg, something like that. A few of them did lose limbs. There was one who lost her leg, another one who lost a hand and part of her groin. Like, the attacks were attacks, period. But it left you like kind of on a cliffhanger to like, are they okay? Like, what's going on? But it came back, and thankfully, I don't want to spoil it, but hopefully you've already watched it. So, warning, warning, spoiler if you're going to watch the show. Fast forward or skip this part. They all survived. They all survived, and you felt like a sense of relief. The thing about this show is that you were completely emotionally invested, and that made it. That's what made it the best show. I felt I was invested in what these people went through. I was invested into the sharks because I was also worried, like, okay, are they gonna go on some like killing spree and trying to kill the sharks? No. They just followed it, made sure that we're where it was going, and then watched it go back out into deep water. So it felt like there were stakes again. Like you felt like, something could happen, what was going to happen. It made you wonder. So that was a really good show. Um, Other side notes that I'm gonna say about overall, I'm I did see some things online that a lot of the shark community was talking about, some of the negatives, where they kept referring to areas as shark infested waters. At this point, we expect Shark Week to do a better job with that, as in stop perpetuating the idea of the killer shark or of shark infested waters. It's not shark infested waters. It's not a people infested house. This is where they live, right? So although I know that the entertainment factor has to be a thing, right? There's also the responsibility of depicting these magnificent animals in a light that makes people not so afraid of them, especially to the point where they may want to cause harm to them, right? We already do enough damage to the oceans, especially sharks. So if we can try and mitigate the damages that we do, that would make all the difference. Um, yeah. So my hands down, if I was to rate all of these shows, Great White Sex Battle was probably like on a 1 to 10. I'd probably give it a 5. I mean, maybe that's generous. It'd be a 4, honestly, 4 or 5. Jaws versus Mega Croc, a little bit better than Great White Sex Battle. I'd probably give it a 6. Um, you know what? You know what? I'm gonna go 5 on Great White Sex Battle only because they had that one experiment that I liked. So I'll give it the full point. Jaws versus Mega Croc. Um, I'm gonna give 5.5 only because I didn't really care for any of the experiments in that show. But it had an overall higher baseline than Great White Sex Battle. Um, but yeah. And then Eye of the Storm, in the Eye of the Storm, Shark Storm, that gave me like a 9. On a 1 to 10, it's like a 9. Like we were fully invested from beginning to end. To the point that after the show ended, my wife researched all of the people, like just to follow along, like what their lives were like and what was going on. She did her own independent research, and any show that makes someone do their own independent shark research is good in my book. So all in all, that was day 2. All right. So now we're preparing for day 3. Let's see what it's hitting for. All right. Keep swimming, my fins. And as always, stay sharktastic. Oh, and for reference, the 3 tests they performed were based off bite force, which they used a chumsicle or bait for the crocodile that had a bite force meter implanted inside of it. Strength, that's where they used a scale to determine how much force each animal will be able to pull by. And the third one was intelligence, where they basically tried to see if each of the animals would be able to basically associate a specific cue with food, i.e., almost like solving a puzzle, right? Not exactly that complex, but They trained the animals in order to recognize a specific cue as to meaning food. So would they make the step from being handed food, using the cue, to then being able to get food themselves using a mechanism? And funny enough, both animals performed well on that.